Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Johnson, and this is Lauren Beasley. And we are from the University of Tennessee, and we are both GTAs, doc students here. The title of our presentation and our research project and future manuscript is called Contrapower Harassment in the Sport Management Classroom, a collaborative autoethnography. And so this project kind of came out of a personal experience that I had several years ago that kind of has set the stage for this whole, essentially my whole experience thus far. So I say underwater basket weaving, and we'll get to that in a second. But I was, several years ago, I was given an opportunity to teach a weight training class, a PE, weight training class. I'm not particularly the best weight trainer, but I was given the opportunity and I had to take it. I didn't really have a choice. And so, I had a choice. I could have just not done it, but then I wouldn't have gotten my foot in the door in other financially beneficial ways. So anyway, I ended up taking it. Very, fresh green instructor. And so the very first day I walked in and I had a student who was very displeased that I was teaching the course, immediately latched on to the fact that I seemed very not confident, which was my first mistake, and several others I learned. It was a great learning experience, but he and I had several kind of inappropriate interactions. And what I mean by that is he would repeatedly make me feel bad in the classroom, call me out. I had several run-ins with him on campus where he would posture and say things that weren't very respectful. And then I even saw him in our city a couple times, and I tried, I always try to stay away from student frequented establishments, but this was one thing that I couldn't avoid. And so anyway, the end of the semester, I had, I'll just read a blurb out of the end of semester evaluation I got. Hands down, the worst teacher I've ever had in my 4 years here. She was not even close to being qualified to teach weight training. She should have taught underwater basket weaving or the power of positive thinking or literally anything else. She had no idea what she was doing, and day one said we could not perform some movements. And I can go into the rest of the story, on an individual basis, but some of what he said was true, but some of it was it was all twisted in a way that put me in a position of he was in power and I was not in power. And that kind of was the catalyst toward my interest in this area. So jumping into our super quick literature review here, as we all know in this room, we're all teaching sport management and related disciplines. Sexism is very prevalent in sport, and it's one of those arenas in which it's very overt in a lot of ways. Think 2016, I believe she talks about it. But sport is one of those special places in which you can walk in. It's more casual. A lot of times it's male dominated. And so those spaces are viewed as more use of casual language, more inappropriate language to kind of try the women in the room. And then contrapower harassment is the act of somebody with less authority harassing, disrespecting, being uncivil to somebody with more authority in that space.
Yeah, and so growing out of that literature, there's been a really subsect of that, looking at academic contrapower harassment, which is specifically when a student who has less power in the relationship harasses a faculty member or instructor who has more power in the relationship. And what this body of literature has really found is that, I guess not surprisingly, female faculty members experience more contrapower harassment and then male faculty members. And it really comes off as incivility in the classroom, disrespect in the classroom, disruption in the classroom. So kind of these more everyday things that isn't sexual harassment, but still certainly a type of harassment.
Mm-hmm. And so finally, we did a cursory literature review on graduate teaching associate training. And there's not much out there. You probably would have to go from school to school to see what they offer. But across the board, based on what I read, most graduate teaching associate trainings are very limited. You kind of walk in, it's kind of the hose in your face kind of experience, and then you're thrown into the classroom. And many of us are not trained instructors. We're not trained teachers. We are learning on the fly. And they said that a lot of instructors, GTAs specifically, would benefit from having ongoing trainings, mentorship, and other resources provided for them. So, kind of touching on what Lauren said as far as academic contrapower harassment, there has been research with female faculty members and their experiences of contrapower harassment. However, there is limited literature pertaining to female GTAs and their experiences of contrapower harassment in the classroom. And a lot of that has to do with the weird power position we're in. We are not fully faculty, but not fully student either. And so that is very confusing, not only for us to experience, but for the students as well.
So specifically, the purpose of this study, is we both are female GTAs in sport-related classrooms, was to conduct a collaborative autoethnography of our own lived experiences. And really, out of this reflexive work, we wanted to identify, initiate the development of some more substantial training that really pinpoint these experiences of contrapower harassment. So the methodology, we did engage in a collaborative autoethnography. So autoethnographies grew out of the field of ethnography. And whereas ethnography is the observation of others, autoethnography is the observation of self. And as you might hear in kind of more post-positivistic qualitative research, the idea of triangulating data. In autoethnography, the term used is assemblage. And the idea there is you're collecting other data sources that can kind of assemble a more clear picture and understanding of your own lived experience. So out of this idea of assemblage came the idea of a collaborative or dual autoethnography, which is where you bring together two or more people with similar lived experiences, with similar kind of positionalities. And you write about that kind of shared experience. And that the idea there is the multiple viewpoints can really create a more assembled view of that lived experience. Specifically, why we chose to engage in collaborative autoethnography is that the literature is really pinpointing this methodology as a great way to improve practice. A lot of times it really grew out of teacher education, the education field. So not only was this a research opportunity for us, but it was a way for us to reflect and improve our own teaching practice in the classroom.
And so we adopted these phases from Hernandez and some of her colleagues. So we went through, or in the process of going through, about 3 phases with the final analysis. So the phase 1, both Lauren and I responded to an initial prompt asking us about our experiences in the classroom and how we feel our gender has played a role. Phase 2, we came together, we talked about, we're very reflexive in our discussion as we were thinking about our responses. We teased out and pared down our stories, and we wanted to make sure we were addressing the research questions we were originally asking. Phase 3, we're kind of in process. We're going to go back and kind of touch on what we've referenced as far as GTA training, and really think about our own experiences training. I've alluded to it a little bit, felt like I was, fire hose and was tossed in there, but would love to kind of explore that a little bit more. Again, we'll tease out those stories and make sure they're informing our research questions, and we will go through a final analysis at the end.
So as Emily said, we're presenting today kind of our preliminary findings from our first round of analysis. So kind of the 3 themes that came out of that analysis. First is the idea that we've experienced micro and macro contrapower harassment, and they are different, with the idea that kind of these micro everyday contrapower harassment is more passive from the student. Versus we have experienced very intentional contrapower harassment. The theme 2 that really came out was the idea of how our positionality really has impacted those experiences of contrapower harassment. And then finally, due to some lack of training, we've really had to develop our own strategies to handle these types of contrapower harassment in the classroom.
So we'll kind of jump in here with our first theme. We're going to go through each theme relatively briefly. So theme 1, micro versus macro, like Lauren explained, there are varying degrees of how we've experienced this in the classroom and related spaces. So we will share and have discovered that we have, obviously our experiences are very individual, but there are similarities that we can point to. And then we've also had passive versus intentional experiences, the experiences in the classroom that are very, they're not overtly disrespectful, but when you reflect on it and you think about how you've managed the classroom space, they were problematic. Or situations in which they're very intentional. The student is having a verbal exchange with you in the classroom that is colored in a way that is not good. And so I always think about when we were kind of really wrestling with this first theme, man, how do you pick just one? I mean, my experiences have run the gamut from being approached, like I alluded to at the beginning, at a location in my city, and having to navigate that space and quickly exit. Whereas I've also had experiences where I've had students blatantly ignore me when I've asked them to sit in a certain place in the classroom, participate in an assignment. It's like whatever it is going in one ear and out the other. They're not even looking at me. I've had students who have teased me about my physical abilities, said that I don't understand how basketball works because I probably can't dunk. Things like that can be very problematic when you're trying to establish authority in the classroom.
Yeah. And when I really reflected back on the experiences I wrote about, I have had very intentional where, a male student has straight up said, I'm not participating in this activity, no matter how much I kind of probed him to do it. And he just kind of sat there and refused to participate. But I've also had a lot of more passive. And what I've kind of reflected on is some of the passive experiences that stick out to me were other female students. And so one in particular, I had a female student in one of my earliest semesters teaching who, would be on her phone in the classroom all the time. She sat in the front so I could literally see her Instagram, and I would ask her to put the phone away. I would take points off from her participation. The behavior never really changed. It was just very kind of disrespectful. She never said anything that was blatantly disrespectful, but kind of not engaging in the class, staying on her phone. And at the end of the semester, I did bring up and was just casually talking to a senior faculty member who was male about the situation. And he looked really surprised and was like, this student's always been great with me. And so in my reflexive journaling on that, I really thought about how possibly the fact that we were both females may have really impacted that experience. In sport, there's almost kind of the sense of scarcity for female positions, which can really, really create tension and competition between females in the sports space versus, a very collaborative and hopefully more empowering experience for females. And she was a non-traditional student, so was maybe even older than me. And so I think age may have really played a part in that as well. And that kind of goes into our next theme, which is the idea of how our specific positionalities have really impacted these experiences. We're only going to share a few stories about a couple of specific positionalities. So in our Q&A session, we can totally expand.
So I'll start with kind of that white fragility idea. So similar to Lauren's story, I did have a student who was never, aggressive in the classroom, but she was a Black woman in my class. We had a pretty significant disagreement via Canvas, or our learning management software, about how I graded her work. And it wasn't honest. She was, I honestly graded her paper, and she was honestly in the wrong as far as how she performed on the assignment. But she was very difficult to work with and to reason with for several weeks, and very frequently harassed me via our learning management software. And I had to bring in I was able to receive support from some faculty members, but at the same time, it was a very troubling experience. And then when I was in the classroom, she would regularly ignore me when I tried to engage her in the conversation. It was a discussion-based course. She displayed disregard for my position in the classroom. And I really wrestled with, and this is kind of where we really think about white fragility. I didn't want to call her out in the classroom because of how I identified as a white woman and how she identifies based on, I never asked her how she identifies, but based on her, how she looks, I identified her as a Black woman. And so really wrestled with that. We've learned a lot about critical race theory and things like that in our graduate program. Sorry, my head's going away. And so but we haven't really learned how to apply some of those concepts in the classroom. And so that was really troubling for me, as I've been reflecting on my experience with her. What could I have done differently? She clearly felt like she was not in control in this particular situation, with both myself as a white woman telling her that she wasn't doing well on the assignment, and my faculty supervisors are white as well. And so that was a problem.
Yeah. And then, so the position I'm going to specifically talk about with this story is the fact that we are GTAs. So we are, in our program, instructors of record for undergraduate classes and upper level undergraduate classes. So many times we are teaching juniors and seniors. But we are also a student, and we are taking our own classes. And so there's many times when a student who we taught as a senior graduates the undergrad program, gets accepted as a master's student, and then we are now in classes with them as peers students. And we've never really been trained or never really talked about how we handle that shift in power dynamic. And so one kind of story that really stood out to me when I was writing this prompt was I had a student, he was a senior, and was also very passively, right, in civil in the classroom, with being on ESPN on his computer, not engaging in course conversations, being on his phone a lot. And, again, no matter how many times I kind of asked or made the statement in class, please don't use your computers for anything outside of classwork. I just always felt very disrespected by him in the classroom. And then fast forward a semester later, he got accepted into our master's program. I'm now in a class with him, put in a group project with him. And so that was I never really addressed that power dynamic, but I felt very uncomfortable as somebody who felt disrespected by the student previous semester. Now we are peers in a group project. And I didn't know how to handle that situation. And I didn't really know how to work through my feelings about the situation. So that's a really interesting experience you have specifically as a GTA that might not get captured in research with female faculty members.
Mm-hmm. And so our last theme a preliminary theme that we've come up with is, because we feel like our GTA training is lacking in some areas, we had to kind of come up with our own strategies. And we all have coping strategies and things that we do whenever we're faced with a stressful situation. And so we've listed a few of the things that we personally have done, and we'll jump into those right now. So for me, I tend to make sure that I'm always wearing heels and dressed really nicely. I want my students to hear me coming down the hallway. My office is not far from the classroom I typically teach in. And I feel that by dressing in a way that is business professional, wearing heels that make noise on the floor, conveys a very business-like, powerful demeanor, which is an interesting double-edged sword, but we can get into that in a later conversation. But I feel that, if I can dress well, look the part, act the part, my students will take me more seriously.
Mm-hmm. And I have very similar experiences and situations with Emily about that too. And I think the idea of how to dress, I always have my nails done in a certain way. We have conversations about what to wear in these kind of sports spaces. And that's something that I think is fairly unique to a female experience in the sport classroom. The other thing, when I was really reflecting on my own strategies, I always sought advice from my fellow GTAs first, even if ultimately I ended up talking to a senior faculty member. My first step was always going to a fellow female GTA. And part of that, in my reflexive journaling that really came out, was, I was really, and still am, very scared to look incompetent to my superiors, right? And I think a lot of that comes from some of this internalized sexism of being a female in a sports space. I don't want to be incompetent for fear that I might lose my spot, right? I don't want to come off as I don't know what I'm doing, because as a female in a male dominated space, I feel like I always have to be one step ahead and doing better than my male peers. And so it is interesting that when I experience these challenges, my first step is I'm going to go talk to my other female GTAs to see if they have a strategy they've used to overcome this before going to senior faculty members or supervisors.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking about some of our kind of preliminary implications that come out of this work, first and foremost, right, this idea that yes, we are trained in Title IX. So if I experience something that is sexual harassment in this classroom, outside of the classroom, I know what to do. I know who to contact at Title IX. I know how that process works. However, we're not trained in how to handle these everyday experiences in the moment. So, when I have the student who's always on their phone, or I have the student who says straight up, I'm not doing this assignment, I don't know how to handle it in the moment. The other kind of major kind of thing that came out with our conversations was that we do experience white fragility in the classroom. And while we are trained in theoretically critical race theory, theoretically, right, critical theory about other identities, when we're on the ground in the classroom, we don't necessarily know how to apply that. So some more specific training on really how to create an anti-racist classroom and what that looks like. And then the other big thing is, more training on how to navigate the dynamics of being both a student and instructor of record, or and instructor in the classroom, and how to handle the shift in power dynamic from when a student who we may have taught is now our peer in the classroom with both of us as students. I think that would be something that would be really helpful in our own professional development and handling our experiences in the classroom.
And then finally, we have a couple future directions. It would be pretty, I think that there's a lot of different qualitative methodologies that could be useful in investigating these experiences and unpacking them. We just so happen to choose collaborative autoethnography for this particular project. It's definitely worth surveying schools about their GTA training related to Contrapower harassment. Like I said at the beginning, there's not a lot out there that compares and talks about GTA training. And so it'd be an interesting study to be able to see, okay, what are other schools doing to prepare their GTAs, if anything, in this type of situation. And then also investigate how Contrapower harassment is experienced by other sectionalities. Obviously, Lauren and I identify as white females, so it'd be interesting to provide these questions, these prompts to women of color and women of other sexual identities, gender identities, those types of things. And so that would be also very eye-opening and be able to compare across sectionalities.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And we look forward to our Q&A session.
Yes, thank you.
Welcome to this Q&A session for Contrapower harassment in the sports management classroom, a collaborative autoethnography. We have Emily Johnson and Lauren Beasley here as the panelists. I have instructions in the chat for questions if you would like to put your name and your affiliation in the chat before asking a question. Other than that, Lauren, Emily, the time is yours.
Thanks everybody for being here. Yeah, we'll open any kind of questions about, if you watched our presentation, we're kind of in the preliminary findings and we're still kind of working through analysis. So this is also just an awesome time. We can have conversations about this too. That would help us move forward.
Do you have any updates, since you've recorded to give us, just so we can be up with the most current information that you've been analyzed?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So we're kind of we're much farther in, I would say, to phase 2 now. So kind of really solidifying those themes. And so really what the findings, I think, and Emily, you can touch on this too, the findings that were in the presentation are pretty much solidified, I think, as our findings now. So, which is good. And I guess we could review those, Emily, if you want to touch. Yeah.
Oh, we do have a question from Emily from St. John Fisher College.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for that great presentation. I wish I would have had it 17 years ago when I was really in that situation and needing it. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the background stuff that you found. When you're looking at some of this Contrapower literature, what are some of the same things, or did you find the same things with junior faculty, like untenured female faculty or untenured persons of color, or other sort of, people of the Big Ten identity groups? Did you find sort of similar things happening in those populations?
Yeah, so that was one of the main concerns that Lauren and I had when we were kind of jumping into this, was that there is a relatively deep layer of literature that does speak to the experiences of faculty members. Now, I would have to go back and see if they were tenured track or if they were tenured or otherwise, but they were very similar. So a lot of the women in those positions were experiencing a whole host of contrapower incivility in the classroom and in those related spaces, primarily not only in some of the similar experiences that Lauren and I shared, but definitely on those in the end of semester evaluations and arenas like that. It was very prevalent. And what we found is, first, there's definitely room to study more for those individuals who identify as people of color, minority status, so on and so forth. There's not much out there in that regard, but there was not a lot of information that I could find about GTAs, female GTAs, and especially at institutions like Tennessee, and I'm sure it's the same across the board at a lot of other institutions. GTAs teach a lot of the undergrad classes, and so it was interesting when we were reflecting on our experience and reflecting on the literature that all this is happening to female faculty members, but what about women who are not faculty members, who aren't being studied, and the resources clearly aren't available, or there is limited.
Yeah, and adding on that, like in the host of like academic contrapower harassment, they even kind of sub-label that now. There is a lot with female faculty members, and our findings similar to that yes, sexual assault surely happens, and the resources for that are really helpful, but female faculty are kind of reporting more often these little incivilities, right? So them, students questioning their power in the classroom, or pushing back on completing assignments, or being, on their computers, even when asked like, hey, let's switch off ESPN or whatever that might be. And there's not a lot of training specifically on that type of incivility. And that was kind of, I think, our biggest takeaway, and what we've seen in the lit is like, I know, like, if I experience something that would be a Title IX violation, like, I know what steps to take. Like, I know who to go to, what channels, but it's more like the little things that I'm unsure of how to handle in the moment that wouldn't be a Title IX violation, right?
And along with that, I really like what you said about this insecurity of going to your current faculty. Like, I don't want to feel inept. Then you have this whole imposter syndrome that's probably on top of that could sort of compound this issue. I guess the thought I had about that, though, was that, given what you just said about the depth of literature and the experiences, are there other ways that we can work to establish, mentoring programs outside of institutions that would not sort of put you in a further questioning position of power with people that are going to be evaluating your dissertation and giving you recommendations for things, but that can still be part of that support network and circle? I wonder if there are ways that we can think about that moving forward until we can get a body of literature on how to and what to do with some of those things. So just a thought.
Yeah, that's a great thought. I think that, and we see this, across the board in a lot of different sport disciplines. Mentorship is so needed, and mentorship, especially for women sometimes, and people of color, and other minority groups, mentorship opportunities sometimes are limited because there's just not as many folks available to mentor. And so I think that would be a great step and a great direction to go. So maybe within COSMA and other related organizations, having a women's group, women's mentoring group that doesn't necessarily only have to focus on Contrapower harassment, but other, just experiences in higher education that are unique to women would be a great step in the right direction. And I always think it would be great to have an opportunity to practice some of these things. Lauren and I were talking just before this. I don't think many of us have, the skill set to be able to attack confrontation in the moment. I think that's really, not something we're all used to doing. And so, practicing how to handle these situations, and doing, role playing and stuff like that at some point, maybe not in the women's group, but maybe down the line, as we're learning how to improve some of the trainings, that could be something we could do as well. It's just a side note as I'm thinking out loud, but yeah. Thanks for the question.
I can add to, and Rob, I know you're here, so feel free to jump in if you have thoughts too, but Rob is my advisor. So it's awesome. But so something we've talked about a lot is teaching kind of, and having full faculty members really think about what am I the right person to talk, when am I the right person to talk to? So Rob and I have reflected a lot on he's when people come to me and they're saying, I'm experiencing this in the classroom, he's I have an idea of who I can then say, I think you should go talk to this person, right? As a male faculty member, I might not be the best person for you to process this with, but knowing who to guide me towards is also really important kind of for full-time faculty members.
Yeah, I can comment on that. I'll put a couple citations in the chat as well. And I think a lot of it has to do with, and Lauren and Emily both can comment on this, about victim shaming and things of that nature, which is obviously an issue across sport in itself, and sexual harassment, sexual assault literature. But that's part of the issue. And this all kind of started with me with another doctoral student about 6 years ago, when there was an incident in a classroom, and that person came to me, and I'm a 45-year-old white male. I don't know what it's like to be contrapower harassment from a male student or a female student in the classroom. And so I quickly sought help from others around me to find out what the best course of action was. And that was tremendous for me and for the student who was facing the issue, one of my advisees who was facing an issue. So that was key. And I think that goes right along with what Emily was saying about handling that confrontation immediately is a challenge, but having the tools in place and the training in place. And we talk about that a lot at Tennessee with our doctoral students, about being prepared in the classroom and how to handle that in the classroom in those type of situations. So, and Lauren and Emily can comment on that too, as far as what we do at Tennessee to try to, I don't know if you could ever prepare somebody for that situation, but prepare them for the best in that situation. And it works both ways. If the victim shaming, and then if you go to help, and then if you're oh, it's no big deal, don't worry about it, you should take it as a compliment that if somebody whistled at you in the classroom, and that we got those comments a lot from these other studies. So I'll let Heather ask her a question. I'll put those citations in so you can kind of give you maybe a reference point to start with some other research.
What consequences are there for students who are harassing their faculty? And are they followed through with? And have any students ever been kicked out of a program or out of a school You know, how does the system support its faculty in that way?
That's a really good question. I don't know of any situations where where I've reported a student and then it's like followed through. And I think that might be the difference between like talking about like sexual harassment in the classroom, right? Versus like this student just is kind of refusing to do this assignment. So I'm going to, you know, dock his participation points for the day, right? That might kind of be the disciplinary action. So yeah, I don't know. Like I think I find it almost harder to deal with that, those
Right.
small little ones than kind of the larger.
I mean,
Like
it's not
I got
like,
like whistled at in the classroom. Like I think I would feel much more comfortable, you know, walking up to, you know, a faculty member and be like, this happened and I'm uncomfortable, right? Versus like these little like this kid, I think I shared the story, like literally refusing to do the assignment, and kind of all I can do there is like not give them credit for it. But I don't know how to like establish my like authority in that moment in the classroom. So I kind of just let them sit to the side, you know, and I think that ended up influencing the culture of my classroom moving forward for
Right.
sure for the rest of the semester, like kids feeling more comfortable just kind of being on their computer. And so, yeah, so I'm not sure what the reporting structure like at Tennessee is like. But I've certainly never reported, you know, kids. I just kind of will dock their points for participation and that type of thing.
right. Yeah, if there's some kind of, it seems to me like, you know, if it's a structural systematic event, and I understand it's not like, oh, I have my complete, I was expecting that comment and now I'm ready to respond to you in the moment appropriately in the way that I'll look back in 2020 hindsight and be proud of. But given that this is how our society is structured, I wonder if there are ways to help. And I think academic, you know, the academic consequences should be meaningful to the student and feel like that is appropriately, I guess, you know, an appropriate thing for a faculty person or whatever your level is to do.
Well, I'll add, I'm sorry, I need to get called on. So I'll add, so that last citation I put, one of the issues that came up, the issues with faculty, when they would actually go to the department head or admin supervisor, they were basically said, you're overreacting, which the worst thing you can say to anybody is you're overreacting. I don't know anything, but I do know that about really, you know, that's like a big no-no. And so a lot of the a lot of the experiences of the participants in that final study in the Women in Sport and Physical Activity Journal talked about they were faculty members and they went to their department heads with issues and they were basically told, like, you should be flattered, like, oh, you should take it as a compliment that students find you attractive. And so that creates this negative culture, so to speak, that, well, if I go forward, it's just going to be ignored. So do I want to bring this on myself type of environment, which we found to be really, really prevalent in many of the, Lizzie Taylor, she's a faculty member at Temple now. She was one of my former, was a doctoral student of mine, but she's done quite a bit of research on this, as you can tell by the citations. And a lot of stories about women not being heard, their voices not being heard when they had issues.
Yeah, and Emily, you can probably touch on this with one of your stories you talked about, but I think that we as GTAs who like are in that, like internalize that, right? Like I know when Emily and I will like kind of talk about what we're handling in the classroom, like I know the questions that come out a lot is like, wait, am I overreact? Like I asked that, right? Or like, was I correct in like grading her this way and now I'm getting questioned on it? So we internalize that, you know, being in the culture.
Yeah, and I think that because of the pushback that you know, some faculty members have gotten by trying to report it, because I think we've internalized that it's kind of like this he said, she said experience. Everyone, you know, it potentially is a little bit more subjective, you know, and I think that there's times that maybe a situation happens in the classroom and you don't really recognize what happened until you have time to reflect on it. And then it feels like it's too late to report it. And so I think a lot of these things go unreported. And so I think that's a problem too. There hasn't been enough reporting to even start putting into place a system to help stop some of these instances.
And I think that's what really came out of our, like when we were working on, what's so great about the collaborative data analysis, like when we were processing our stories together, it was a constant like, oh, I had something that happened like that. And I didn't even label that as something problematic at the time, because it was just something I would expect a student to do, you know, like, and I didn't realize that, you know, actually made me feel this certain way until we were like talking about it together a year later, you know, which I think is really emblematic of that.
We have a question from Lana.
Hi, can you hear me? Lauren and Emily, thank you for sharing this. I was listening to it and I thought, you know, exactly what you're experiencing. I think most females have felt this way. And just like you just said, Lauren, we don't talk about it a whole lot. We just kind of, you know, we work through it. So I listen to what you said, but I'm thinking, you know, what is the better preparation? So as a grad assistant, someone coming into this field, and you're young and you're female, right? I know, Emily, you said wear high heels, and I've done that forever. So that is one strategy. But short of that, would it be helpful for grad assistants to have some kind of an internal mentor within the department? I mean, if you were matched up with a female faculty who had been there a few years, you know, it doesn't have to be someone who's been there, you know, 30, 40 years, but someone who's been there a few years, just to say, hey, you know, let's just grab lunch here and there and just talk through, what are you experiencing? How are you feeling? Because I do agree, a lot of it is in your perception and your reaction, but I think sometimes we're just shocked into not knowing how to respond. And so if there's a simple statement like, okay, what you're saying to me is making me uncomfortable, so I'm going to walk away, and I'm going to circle back with you later about this. So you can just walk away, right? Go talk to your mentor and then circle back. I don't know. What would you, Lauren and Emily, what would you recommend if you could have it, if you could put together this mentorship program for yourselves? What would it look like?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think the problem is it seems like it's very retroactive. Like I felt when I've had some of these experiences, I mean, our faculty was great. You know, I was able to, when I got up the gumption and it got to the point where I couldn't handle it myself, which is a problem. I was able to reach out to my faculty, my faculty supervisors and support system, and they were able to help me navigate that system and were definitely my advocate. But I think you're right. There's this element of we're not prepared on the front end to be able to be confident enough to tell a student, okay, I need you to stop. We need to press pause on this, and I'm going to come back to you. And I think about kind of touching on what Lauren said, it's almost like we need to have a conversation following up with the Title IX conversation. You know, I know at UT, new GTAs were supposed to go to I think it's like a day-long orientation. And they talk about a variety of different things, but the thing that is missing is what happens when you are in these situations in the classroom. But we'll talk about, you know, what happens when there's sexual harassment in the classroom. And as Lauren talked about, and as some of the literature does say, yes, definitely those Title IX issues happen, but there's these other issues that are more ethereal, I guess.
Do you think they're more subtle, and that's why you're like, well, that just didn't make me feel right, but it's not it's not on the handout they gave me at the training.
Yeah, it's not one of the bullet points.
Right. So am I overreacting? Am I being too sensitive? And is there just some if there's a mentor or someone that's right there that you can call and say, hey, I just want to hash this through. Because sometimes just talking it through might help.
Yes,
Okay.
I think that's definitely a great step in the right direction, because Lauren and I find that we will have a conversation with the two of us in the office, and we'll say, oh my gosh, or we'll call each other. I just had this experience. Can you debrief it with me? And we find ourselves in a lot of scenarios, because we're basically kind of in the same boat, just separated by 1 year. We'll be like, well, I don't know. I mean, that sounds problematic to me, but I guess if I was in that situation, maybe I would do this. But we don't have, there's not, our department doesn't have, we have a couple women, but we haven't been linked up with them to be able to have that more intimate conversation and be like, okay, you're a few years removed from me. What do you think? So I think that would be a great asset, is having more of a mentorship system.
Yeah. And I think that starting that prior to us entering the program, right? Like once we're accepted, it's like, hey, here's a female faculty member. Let's, check in with her before you even start, right? So you can start having those conversations. And I think you're so right. Even just being like a list of like, you can use this phrase, right? If you're not sure what to say in a situation, even the word that having that wording before we step into a classroom would be so helpful. So then we don't feel like we're kind of like on the spot and have no kind of word bank to pull from to have those conversations.
We have a question from Emily.
I've had these same conversations with Lizzie at conferences, so this has been going on forever. But I also think, and something that I've focused on in some of my research, is we don't teach doc students how to teach. We don't teach anybody how to teach. And so I'm wondering how much of this is commingled with, I don't have a classroom management strategy because I don't know what classroom management strategies are. I don't really know how to design a good test because nobody's ever taught me how to do that, or how to facilitate a dialogue that is less likely to go awry. So I think some of this too might be sort of commingled with this idea of, if we don't have confidence in the classroom period, we are even less equipped to handle some of those things. So, I'm wondering, as a discipline, where can we remedy that? Because I think that would also help a lot of things, right? It would help us in interviews when we're trying to get a job, because we've got a little bit more experience on how to handle that classroom, and those first 2 years won't be awful, and all of those other kinds of things.
Sure. No, I completely agree. And I feel very lucky. So I did my first year of best practices in teaching course through the university. And then I took last semester, we have a course in our department called Teaching Undergrad Kinesiology. So I've in that, and then I'm in an online teaching class right now. So, and I can say going through those have been so helpful for classroom management. So I think standardizing that part of the curriculum would be really cool. Having like, Rob, I know we used to require their certificate, right? And so I think the best practices in teaching certificate. And so I think having some of that built into a PhD curriculum is really, because those classes have been so helpful. And I wish I took them a little bit earlier on even.
Yep. Yeah, we have the university offers the best practice in teaching program. We have a teaching and learning center. And so we used to require all our doctoral students to go through that program in their second semester. They would teach the first semester, get some of them had no teaching experience whatsoever. And then they would take that. It's eight times, I think, during the semester. And that goes along with this is how you make a syllabus, this is how you do a test. I think they're like 2-hour workshops. And at the end, you get a best, it's a certification of some sort. Universities hand those out pretty freely. But we do that. I think too, Emily, you make a good point about how do you handle that? And everybody handles it differently. With my student who had that issue before, she was just like pissed off about it. She was like, I cannot believe this is happening. And she was just furious. And so then I referred her to a female faculty member in our department. I'm like, you need to go talk to this person because I can't relate to that. So once she worked through that initial shock, I guess, and anger of the situation that had occurred, we circled back around and we met, you know, and said, okay, these are the next things that we need to do as far as this is how we need to address the situation with the student that where the first incident occurred. So that's kind of how we do that. And, you know, the research that Lizzie and I have, well, Lizzie primarily, me as her advisor, did. I mean, I think you're right on, Lena and Emily. Everybody has a story. I mean, it was just amazing. Like, can you believe this happened to me? It was like one of those kind of like I'd read the transcripts of the interviews, and I'm just like, I can't. And it's just all under. It's just under the current. Like nobody talks about it, and and that kind of comes back to the, you know, the victim shaming. And then the student that had the issue that I was advisor for, she actually sought advice from another faculty member at another university, and she was victim shamed by that female faculty member at another university about how she was dressing. And I'm like, that's not supportive. Like that was kind of interesting situation as well about that. But yeah, good points, good stuff.
Yeah, adding on to that, Rob, I think like, and going back to kind of we did like a collaborative autoethnography, right? And we found that methodology in itself was so helpful because like really at the base of it is improving practice, like that it grew out of teacher education. And being able to work through those stories together was really liberating. So I think just engaging in more of that kind of research as a discipline, it just gave us a spot to like process through those stories, which I don't even think as a researcher, right, you don't really get to doing basic qualitative interviews, right? It was a great way for us to really work through our own stories. So yeah, maybe just a plug for more kind of that kind of research, collaborative autoethnography in the field too would be really helpful.
Yeah, and then I'll just add on and say, I think Emily, you're onto something as far as better training for GTAs before they're entering the classroom. That's something that I wish that I had. And I have done the best practices in teaching certificate even before. I did it when I was in my master's. And I remember sitting and talking to the faculty supervisor of the class I was teaching and was sweating bullets because I had no idea what I was going to do on the first day. And that was I just felt like that was a very uncomfortable situation for me because it was over and above the normal nervous. I just didn't know what I was doing. And so I think this project could definitely lead into and points to other areas that can be improved for training GTAs who are not, I'm not a trained teacher. I don't have a teaching license or anything. And that would be definitely a step in the right direction as far as giving more confidence. So that way, hey, now I have confidence in the classroom as an instructor, throw it at me. Whatever you have, I have more confidence in that arena. So thank you for that comment.
Yeah, that piece is only one of it. And I don't expect us to all go out and get, teaching certifications and things of that nature. But, even the basics of brain-based biology and the situation right now with trauma-based teaching, and so much of it is not us. It's not anything we can do. It's just the situation we're faced with, and without any foundation or a sporadic preparing future faculty, here or there, it's really challenging to effectively communicate a subject matter in this climate.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I might add, when we're talking about mentoring, I think too that like our major finding was definitely, like Emily brought up, we process with each other first before we think, okay, is this something that I need to take to Rob, right? Or is this something that, Emily needs to take to her advisor? And so we're very lucky that like our office environment is very healthy in the, between us. But I know from other stories I've heard from my colleagues across the country, like a lot of times GTA offices can be very competitive, right? And it doesn't feel as safe of a space. And so I think when we talk about mentoring too, it's how do we best connect, like, PhD students that are farther along with PhD students that are just coming in. And even that in itself, like creating that relationship prior to a new PhD student starting is really helpful. And I know we do that. We definitely do that at Tennessee. Like Natalie she was a third year when I started, and she reached out to me like right when I got in, and we started having conversations. And so I think even those kind of mentoring, not just from faculty to student, but from farther along student to new student, right, is really helpful, because that's where we start our processing. And I definitely have heard stories where those kind of conversations don't happen as well in GTA class, because there's so much competition for jobs, right? And as females already in this space, we feel like other females might be competition. And so I think it's also creating those relationships was really important for us, which is harder during COVID, right? Because we're not necessarily in the office too. So that adds like another layer to all of this.
Okay, we've reached then if there are any other last minute questions, or if Lauren and Emily have anything else they'd like to add.
I just want to thank everybody for coming and supporting us. We are, obviously, this is a very kind of sensitive subject, and we put ourselves out there. And so thank you very much, everybody, for your words and your encouragement and the conversation.
Nicely done, guys. Good job.
Thank you guys, and enjoy the rest of the conference.